Now, more research has been released into preventing xenophobic violence in South Africa. The African Policing Civilians Oversight Forum has released its second of 3 research papers on this particular matter. It's recommending that government develops tools to help community policing forums deal with xenophobic violence. It further recommends that these forums be more inclusive of foreign citizens. Louise Edwards from the organization joins me now from Cape Town to discuss this matter further. Many thanks for your time, Louise, this evening. Talk us through some of what the report has explored.
Hi, good evening, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about the research and the work. So we've been undertaking some research to try and unpack and understand some of the challenges facing policing and the broader policing sector when it comes to the prevention, the detection and the resolution of xenophobic violence. So as you mentioned, we did some earlier research on the role of SAPs, but what was becoming very apparent in terms of the work of ourselves and those doing the field work is the role for community police forums in terms of the way in which xenophobic violence can play out, and the critical role they potentially play in terms of preventing xenophobic violence. And in summary, what the research has shown us is that where community police forums are representative of the communities they serve, and where they are inclusive and include either membership of or partnerships with non-national interests, we see them having a more effective role in preventing xenophobic violence. Where they are captured spaces, where they're politicised spaces, where they are not inclusive and where they don't have support from either the provincial secretariats of Civilian Secretariat of Police or national, they oscillate between either having no impact in terms of how xenophobic violence brews and results in their communities, or on the other end of that spectrum, there's evidence that they can be part of instigating and fueling that violence, which is very concerning.
Right, and that's where we've had difficulty in South Africa in particular, not being able to get the instigators before things turn terribly bad. We saw this with the violent unrest in July. And I just want you to maybe explain the importance of provincial and national institutions in supporting these community policing forums when it comes to ensuring that we are able to create enough oversight to prevent such incidents from happening.
Yeah, so I think the key here is an understanding from national to provincial level all the way down to your local CPFs and their sub-forums about understanding what a prevention mandate means. And we tend to think about prevention of violence generally and the prevention of xenophobic violence more specifically as being crisis management, whereas we actually have a broader architecture for violence prevention in this country that was born through the 2016 White Paper on Safety and Security that challenges us to look at prevention in a more holistic way and to address, to look backwards and say, well, what are some of the drivers at an individual, at a community, at an interpersonal and at a societal level that cause and fuel this type of violence? If we could support CPFs to understand and execute their role of prevention in being more than just crisis management in the moment, but engaging in prevention activities such as community outreach, providing information and support to SAPs, because they are supposed to be providing that information and providing an oversight over the way that SAPS responds to issues raised before the violence actually, there's an outbreak. It's absolutely would be the first step. And it's going to require training of CPFs, it's going to require funding and support of CPFs, and it's going to require the Civilian Secretariat of Police to finalise the regulatory and policy framework for CPFs, because unfortunately they're operating under outdated regulations and they have no clear finalised policy to guide them on how to do this.
Another important element here, Louise, is the fact that these forums need to be inclusive of non-nationals. This, no doubt, it's no doubt a very difficult thing to do, given our history with foreign nationals in the country.
Look, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. The policy framework as it stands for community policing forums speaks to issues of inclusivity. And so too the draft SAPS amendment bill, which was reframing to an extent the relationship between SAPS and CPFs, that also referenced the need for inclusivity and the need to involve vulnerable groups or groups vulnerable to violence in their communities or vulnerable to crime in their communities into CPF structures. What we don't have is guidance in terms of which groups those are and should be. And we would argue strongly that there's very strong evidence from field research that was done as part of this study that where you do involve these communities, it not only strengthens the capacity of the CPF to engage, as I mentioned earlier, in that more broad-scale prevention, but it more broadly promotes cohesiveness and more broadly promotes a kind of a whittling away of some of the deeply entrenched xenophobic attitudes, unfortunately, that we find in many of our communities. So it's not impossible, and indeed the regulatory and policy framework would in fact call for it, as difficult as it may.